The NFL Combine is complete. Who were the winners and which ones may interest the Jets? All this and more on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, March 7th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you for making this show your first listen or your first watch each day. We're free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, click the subscribe button. You'll never miss an episode. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy this episode, big thumbs up. It helps the channel out, helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Well, the NFL Scouting Combine is now complete. It took place over the weekend. It actually began Thursday, or I guess technically it began earlier in the week. Players began arriving. They did media sessions. So did coaches and GMs. But the athletic testing drills, which are the main focus of the event, took place Thursday through Saturday in Indianapolis. And there are some other things. I talked about this last week. The medicals are important. The one-on-one interviews players do with teams are important. But most of the attention we focus on is on the tangible drills because we don't know what happens in these meetings unless something leaks to the media. And we don't know what happens with the medicals unless something leaks to the media. The drills happen right in front of us. They are nationally televised, which I tell you, I watch this sometimes and I'm like, why am I watching this? Why am I watching a player run the 40-yard dash? Don't I have anything better to do? So I hope you had something better to do and are just looking at the results. I can't believe how much of this I watched. I mentioned this on a show a few weeks back that, I'm not that interested in it. I guess I really had not much going on this weekend, but I spent as much time as I did watching it. But on today's show, I want to talk about some of the players who were what I view as winners of the Combine. And these are players who gave you some sort of testing score that I think taught you something new about them or confirmed something about them. And I'm not going to talk about losers. And the reason I'm not going to do that is because the vast majority of these players are going to have a pro day. And what always happens, people who are panicking because somebody did not perform as well as you thought they would, they'll go to their pro day, they'll perform a lot better, and it will be as though this combine never happened, that these terrible combine results didn't happen. And in any event, there were lots of really good performances at the combine. There were very few players who did not perform well during these drills. I mean, these 40 times were so fast in particular that you almost wonder, like, was something going on there? I mean, were this many position groups historically fast in this class? A class which is generally speaking not viewed as one of the great classes in NFL history, recent NFL history. I don't know, but I wanted to talk about some of the players who I thought performed really well. And again, I want to keep it in context. If I was expecting somebody to go out there and be a great athlete and they were performing well, I'm not going to mention them. And this is not a comprehensive list. This is just a few players who caught my attention and could be somewhat intriguing to a certain extent for the Jets. And I'll begin with a couple of skill position players. I'm going to give you 2 wide receivers and 2 running backs. And the first wide receiver I want to mention is a guy I profiled on a Prospect Friday show a couple of weeks back, and that's Garrett Wilson, the wide receiver out of Ohio State. And I told you there's a lot that I like about Garrett Wilson, but one of the questions I have about him was his deep speed, his long speed. The 40-yard dash doesn't tell you a whole lot at certain positions because there aren't a lot of positions on the field where you're running 40 yards in a straight line. Wide receiver is one of them. Now, it's not the entire role at the position, but there are going to be moments where you're just running in a straight line down the field trying to be the deep guy. And one of the things I questioned about Garrett Wilson was whether he had great deep speed. In fact, in the context of that show, I mentioned that I wasn't particularly expecting him to test all that well. And I was trying to make the point that even if he doesn't test well, he's got good speed, the speed that matters in the NFL, changing direction, cutting. Well, as it turns out, he went out and ran a great 40, as a lot of guys did this past weekend. He was in the 4.3 range. And that makes me, again, that's one of those things that makes me question a little bit what was going on with the times. Because I don't think I ever watched Garrett Wilson at Ohio State and thought I saw somebody who was like Deshaun Jackson fast. But no matter what it is, and there's always a little bit of variation because, you're starting from like a 4-point stance. It's really like more of a track and field type thing. And some players train for it. even running 40 yards. You're not running 40 yards the way you would in a game. But that said, there's enough overlap there that tells me, even if he's not really 4.3 fast, he's pretty fast, and he's got deep speed. And that's really one of the few things I questioned about him. I mean, I have a few other minor concerns, but pretty complete prospect in my view, and I guess we can add deep speed to that. It's if nothing else, and I always say this, I said this last week, there's not a 100% overlap between combine results and the athleticism you show on the field, but it's not a 0% overlap, and I think we can at least say his speed's not a weakness, and it's probably a strength. So I think Garrett Wilson, for me, that answered more questions than it would somebody else, somebody you were expecting, or somebody I was expecting to run really fast who did. Now, another guy I want to mention, and this is not really a guy who's going to be on the table for the Jets at either 4 or 10, but that's Christian Watson, the wide receiver from North Dakota State, which, if you're not familiar with North Dakota State, they're a power on the FCS level, the level below the top level in college football, but they're dominant. They've had a couple of quarterbacks drafted early in recent years. Carson Wentz played there. Trey Lance played there. The Jets had a dime back a few years back, Marcus Williams, who played there. Marcus Williams was this guy who was kind of a depth player for the Jets in 2015. And in the first 2 games of 2016, he had a ton of interceptions, kind of made some plays for the Jets. It's a program that is a very good program for a small school. And Christian Watson, a guy who 6'4", 210 pounds, ran his 40 at 4.36 seconds. And he also did very well in the broad jump and the vertical. And I actually wrote an article last week because I did some examination about the type of receivers Joe Douglas likes. And I took the receivers he's brought in for the Jets. And I also took the receivers he brought in as an executive with the Eagles. And one thing that's clear is that Joe Douglas really likes guys who have physical ability. He likes guys who are big, guys who are strong, but also guys who test well, guys who run the 40 fast, and guys who do well in the explosion drills, the vertical, the broad jump. He's more willing to compromise on the drills that test change of direction, agility, the 3-cone, which kind of had a demise this past weekend. It was one of the more random subplots of the combine, how few players were running the 3-cone, especially in the early stages. But this kind of jumped out to me because this to me seems like, and there are plenty of others because so many guys did well this weekend, but Joe Douglas tends to really favor the physical attributes at the wide receiver position. So you could name a lot of guys. Again, I'm not trying to be comprehensive here, just guys who kind of jumped out to me who I think could be options, knowing how the Jets operate. Now, I also want to talk about 2 running backs, and I'm not convinced the Jets are going to go running back early, but there were a couple running backs who did exceptionally well, especially in the 40-yard dash, and they were Breece Hall out of Iowa State and Kenny Walker out of Michigan State. And these are guys who stand out to me for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think that they're both guys who kind of fit into like a zone-based running system, which is what the Jets run. I mean, if you go back 20, 30 years, the zone team was pretty much a zone team. They did nothing but run zone blocking runs. There's not really a team that does that anymore. They're not exclusively zone, but the Jets remain a team that under Mike LaFleur's system, you're probably going to see more zone runs than gap runs. The second reason that these guys kind of jump out to me, and again, I'm not convinced the Jets are going running back early. I think Joe Douglas is a GM who focuses on positional value more than some other GMs might, but with 4 picks in the first 2 rounds, even if you wanted to go away from that philosophy, you could still make sure you're filling your team with top prospects at important positions. You may be able to dip into like maybe one non-premium position in the early rounds because you have that flexibility. But I think one of the things that's interesting when I hear people talk about the Jets is the idea that we need to get a power back to pair with Michael Carter. And I'm not totally convinced of that fact. I actually wrote an article a few weeks back, and by pretty much any power metric, Michael Carter was really good in 2021. Now listen, the sample sizes were admittedly very small, and perhaps there was some degree of statistical noise there. And I get that Carter's undersized, and I think maybe that's where this is coming from, is Carter's a little bit smaller than your typical back, but there's really not a lot of evidence that he's unable to get the job done as a power runner when you're talking about yards after contact, when you're talking about power situations, the 4-minute drill when you're trying to preserve a lead late in the fourth quarter and everybody knows you're running it. You're talking about short yardage situations. Carter performed at least average in all of these areas. I think what Carter really lacks, and I don't think he has like that 5th gear where he can, be a threat to take it to the house, 70, 80 yards away on a consistent, nobody's consistently doing that, but I don't know that he's got like that extra gear in his game. So I feel like the back you want to pair with him is maybe like a big play guy, a guy who can take it the distance. Again, I know it's counterintuitive because Carter, you don't think of Carter as like this big Derrick Henry kind of back who can just lower his shoulder and pound it in there, but he gets it done. He's gotten it done, and I feel like maybe you want more of a big play back to pair it with him. So I look at maybe some of the guys who ran fast, and Kenny Walker is a guy who was an exceptional back at Michigan State, and really the one thing I was looking at, because he's got ability to make guys miss, and I think he reads his blocks well. The one thing I was looking at, and I felt like he'd run pretty well, but it was one of those things I think it kind of confirmed that this could be like a big play kind of guy. So those are a couple guys who kind of stood out to me as I think about the team the Jets want to build. So those are the guys at the skill positions, but there are plenty of other players who were standout performers in the combine this weekend. In fact, one team that dominated college football this year had defensive lineman after defensive lineman standing out at the combine. And I'll tell you about that team and who the players were ahead here on this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. To get ready for the combine, players underwent a lot of training. They worked on the drills they'd be participating on in Indianapolis. A lot of them were focusing on their diets. Well, if you're focusing on your diet, let me tell you about Built Bar. Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar on the market, but it does not taste like a protein bar. All bars are covered in 100% real chocolate, and they only contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. And there are so many delicious flavors. Puffs is the first ever protein-infused marshmallow. It's puffy, it's marshmallowy. It's not just a protein bar, it's a treat, and it's covered in 100% real chocolate like all the other Built Bars. You got mint brownie, you got coconut almond, and for this month you have white chocolate cookies and cream. They're all delicious, and new flavors are coming out all the time. If they think a flavor might be good, they'll make it. It will be delicious, and it will be good for you. So go to Built.com. You'll be able to see what flavors are out there. You'll be able to buy some Built Bars. They're really good. You'll love them. Again, that's Built.com, Built.com for delicious Built Bars. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or your first watch every day. We're free and available on all platforms. If you like what you see or hear, click the subscribe button. You'll be notified as new episodes are posted. And if you're watching on YouTube, once again, I ask you every day, give this episode a thumbs up. It helps the channel out. It helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Well, we're talking about some of the winners at the NFL Scouting Combine over the weekend. And in the first segment, I discussed some of the skill position players, and this is not a comprehensive list, but some of the guys who caught my eye this weekend as I think about the Jets building up their roster. Now I want to talk about the trenches. And one guy who stood out, and I want to mention this guy because there was lots of buzz around him with the Jets at the Senior Bowl. Jets coaching staff coached him, and that's Trevor Penning, small school offensive lineman, guy who may be moving inside to guard. And it's not so much what he had an excellent combine. And it's as much as anything, I've mentioned this last week, the combine to me is more important for the smaller school guys than it is the bigger school guys, because when you're dealing with smaller school guys, they're not facing great competition. They're facing lesser competition. Sometimes the smaller school guys dominate just because the competition isn't so great. It's not so much that they're dominating. So I think this is the type of thing that can provide you context when you talk about a small school player. How athletic are they really? How strong are they really? How well do they move? And Trevor Penning, by most accounts, did very well. So another guy, I have my eye on this guy. I feel like there's a chance the Jets may take him early. We know Joe Douglas's team building philosophy is trying to fortify the trenches, especially along that offensive line. Both drafts Joe Douglas has run, the Jets have drafted an offensive lineman early. So it's going to catch my eye. Lots of standout performances this weekend. I can't name them all. In fact, it might be easier to name the guys who were not standout performers among prominent prospects. But Trevor Penning, because there was so much buzz at the Senior Bowl, he did nothing to hurt his status heading into the draft. And the guy I have my eye on for the Jets in the early stages. But if we're talking about the defensive line, I think we got to talk about the University of Georgia. And there's no surprise that these guys were great. I mean, listen, this was a defense that carried Georgia to a national championship. So I think we all knew that there were lots of talented players on this defense. But I mean, their defensive line dominated this combine. It was unbelievable. You have Trayvon Walker, the edge rusher. You have on the defensive line Devontae Wyatt, and you especially have Jordan Davis, a guy who was a nose tackle at 340 pounds, which was down about 20 pounds from the weight he played at during the season. Reportedly goes out and runs a 4.79 and dominates every drill. I mean, it's not just the 40-yard dash. He dominated every drill. Now, I'm not sure the Jets are going to draft a defensive tackle early again. In fact, I know how unpopular that would be in the fan base. And it's funny because you go back to 2011, the Jets drafted Muhammad Wilkerson in the first round. And Wilkerson in Rex Ryan's game was more of a defensive end because the Jets were running more of an odd front, a 3-4 type defense under Rex. But he was an interior defensive lineman. And at the time, the reaction was, finally, it was actually kind of similar to when the Jets drafted Mekhi Becton a few years ago. Finally, the Jets are investing in the defensive line, a position that had been neglected at the time. And ever since then, the Jets have done nothing but draft interior defensive linemen early. They drafted Quentin Coples the next year, Sheldon Richardson the year after that. 2 years later, you got Leonard Williams. A few years after that, you got Quinnen Williams. So it's gotten to the point where the Jets don't want to draft interior defensive linemen. So I think a guy like Walker might be a more likely pick for the Jets than Davis or Wyatt. But it's definitely worth watching. And, when I think about Jordan Davis, and this is one of the things I'm kind of evolving my view on him, I think one of the things you have to watch when you're scouting players is you have to differentiate what they're asked to do from what they're capable of doing. Because sometimes a player is capable of doing more than their role in their specific system. And you look at what Georgia did last year on defense. Georgia had so many NFL players on that defense. I mean, you saw, again, there were so many guys at Georgia who dominated the combine, who are great prospects, that to build that defense, Kirby Smart, who's their head coach and a guy who's known for being an excellent defensive coach, he asked Jordan Davis to really be a space eater. And I think you got to be careful here because, I saw people like prognosticating that because Jordan Davis ran in the 4.7s, that suddenly means he's a pass rusher. Well, the two aren't strictly correlated. It's one thing to be able to run 40 yards in a straight line. There's not a ton of overlap with rushing the passer, but if you look at the athleticism, I do wonder a little bit, and that's factoring in some of the other drills, some of the more change of direction type drills, some of the explosion type drills. I do wonder, whether this is a case, and this is also something I've been kind of looking at because, again, he came in at 340 after playing 360 this year. I wonder whether there's more skills than we saw at Georgia, where he was a really good run stuffer. And I don't think that the guy he was at Georgia is necessarily a great fit for this Jets defense, but a guy who's more of a playmaker, is he capable of being more of a playmaker? Because in Georgia's defense was so much surrounding talent, they could rotate guys in, rotate guys out, keep everybody fresh. They didn't need him to rush the passer because they had all this other talent. So just something to keep in mind. I think it's the type of thing I want to keep an open mind with when we talk about not just Davis. It's more, and as much as I'm talking about Davis right now, I'm just talking about prospects in general. I think sometimes we are too quick to dismiss prospects having other skills than they displayed in college. We're too quick to dismiss the idea that they can improve, that they can flash other parts of their game. They can flash other skill sets. So something to keep in mind. But I mean, you look at this Georgia defense. I mean, it's no great shock that they had such great combines. It's no great shock that there are so many players on that defense who are viewed as top NFL prospects. It's just notable how that one school dominated everything. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I'll finish with my combine thoughts. There's a position of great need for the Jets, and there were a couple of players who I thought really stood out. What is this position, and who are the players? Well, I'll talk about that ahead on this Monday episode of Locked On Jets. Of course, our attention was on the Combine this last weekend. Pro days are ahead. There will be team visits leading up to the NFL draft, but NFL games are over. Basketball, however, is full steam ahead for both pro and college hoops. We're coming up on championship week, which will lead us into March Madness. And from all the latest odds, totals, player performance props to where the next fired coach is going to land, betonline.net is the number one spot for all your sports betting needs. Because BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, and UFC odds. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Monday, talking about the NFL Scouting Combine and offering a list of some of the players who stood out. Not all of them. We're not going to be able to get to everybody. There were lots of great performances from the Combine. In fact, we're not even talking about every position. I mean, there's some linebackers who did well. There were some safeties who did well. But in this final segment, I want to talk about the corner position. I'll talk about a couple of the players that I thought really kind of separated themselves from the field, at least as far as athletic tools go. And corner is significant because Robert Saleh comes from that Pete Carroll school at corner where probably above anything else, they want guys with length, guys with long arms who can jam at the line of scrimmage, play press coverage, although I don't know how much press coverage the Jets played on early downs this past year, but I think in an ideal world, they want guys they can develop. They think that you get somebody with length, you can coach him up, develop him into a good corner. Now, there's one guy who is probably going to be a first-round pick who could be on the table for the Jets at 10. He's from Cincinnati, and that's Sauce Gardner, who went out there and ran a 4.41 40, and he's got length. He's 6'3", and in the Saleh Carroll mindset, you want a guy with at least like 32-inch arms, ideally in the 33-inch arm range. Again, you want length. 33.5 inches his arms were. So a guy who, in many ways, I think could be a pretty good fit, could kind of fit the mold of what the Jets are looking for. Would the Jets go corner in the first round? That may work a little bit against the way Saleh's operated in the past, but I don't think you could totally rule it out. So this was a guy who was excellent in college. I thought held his own when he faced better competition in the Peach Bowl, matched up a lot against Jamison Williams. Did a pretty solid job there, so that's a little bit of context. Although in that game, I did wonder a little bit about Cincinnati's scheme, because I remember watching the Peach Bowl. It seemed like they were trying to take away the deep ball schematically because Alabama gashed them in the run game, and it felt like Cincinnati was leaving light boxes, daring Alabama to run, and that's exactly what Alabama did. But a guy who has very good film in Sauce Gardner, who went out there and did nothing to hurt himself. And again, measurements are important for the Jets as far as the cornerback position goes, because Saleh has a specific mold that he likes. He likes guys with long arms. And another guy I just want to mention, this is a smaller school guy, Texas San Antonio, Tariq Woolen, who I mentioned you want at least 32 inches on your arms. He measured in at 33 5/8, and beyond that, he ran a 4.26 40. So this could be a guy maybe the Jets look at. I think he could be an intriguing option. There are plenty of guys, and I'm probably not mentioning as many as I should because there are so many. I mean, we could go on. This show could last 24 hours with me talking about all the guys who did well at the Combine, but I did want to give you a few names, guys who really caught my attention, guys who I think could fit what the Jets are looking for. So I talked skill guys, I talked linemen, and in this last segment I talked corners. These are all spots where I could see the Jets maybe looking to upgrade their roster with players who fit their schemes. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, if you enjoy the show, subscribe to it on your favorite podcast source or on YouTube. You'll never miss an episode if you do, and you will receive notifications as new episodes of Locked On Jets are posted. And again, if you're watching on YouTube, say it every day. Helps the channel out. Thumbs up if you like this episode. Helps other Jets fans find the channel. I hope you have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.